Hello, Brubs. We're back with Three Loves of Dostoevsky. I was going to read it last night. The second chapter, whatever it is, second part. But long night at work, so let's do it now before I go back to the place. Fyodor Dostoevsky, born in 1821, had been brought up in a large family of 5 brothers and 2 sisters, absolute power over which was wielded by the father Michael, the elder, a doctor attached to the Mariinsky Hospital for the poor in Moscow, completely controlled the lives of his children. Dr. Dostoevsky was fond of saying that an ancestor of his had been with Prince Kurbsky at the time of the latter's famous correspondence with Tsar Ivan the Terrible, and that his line went back to the Tartar Golden Horde. He himself, however, could boast neither of distinction nor wealth. The son of a priest, he belonged to the impoverished and deteriorated gentry and could hardly be regarded as successful. Ambitious and harsh, he considered himself overlooked. His career was a modest one, and he barely managed to make ends meet. Hot-tempered, morose, and suspicious, he was given to pathological exaggerations in his fancies. He continually imagined that all sorts of wrongs had been done him. He accused his wife of infidelity in the 7th month of pregnancy and was tortured by his suspicions. His outbursts of wrath also bore the same abnormal character. It is possible that Fyodor's epilepsy was due to an eruption of his father's uncurbed temper. Possibly, too, there was some act of cruelty to his mother or one of the domestics. Yanovsky, who was the family physician, speaks of this in enigmatic terms. Fyodor Mikhailovich was overtaken precisely during his childhood by that somber and oppressive something which never passes without exacting a penalty during mature years. That the father was horrible during such flare-ups was known from the testimony of his son, Andrew, but it is also known that he never laid a finger on his children, and that corporal punishment, so generally accepted at that time, not only in Russia but in England and America, was never resorted to in his family. Was this perhaps what Fyodor was thinking of when he wrote enthusiastically to his brother Michael in later years? Come, our parents were people of advanced views. The relations between father and children, especially the sons, were really friendly. There is no doubt, however, that an iron discipline prevailed in the God-fearing and conservative household of Dr. Dostoevsky, and that the heavy hand of the father was felt in all the small details of family life. It is difficult to form a judgment concerning Fyodor's subconscious enmity toward his father and his attachment to his mother. The children were brought up to obedience. The father instilled fear and respect into them, and they had to toe the line. In the small wing of the Mariinsky Hospital where the Dostoevskys lived, I read that's how it's supposed to be stated, pronounced Dostoevsky, lived with their 7 domestics. No frivolity of any sort was tolerated. A Puritan atmosphere prevailed in the household, and women could be referred to only in poetic terms. The brothers Dostoevsky could not possibly have carried on any flirtations or have been openly infatuated in their youth. They were never allowed to go anywhere by themselves and were never given any pocket money up to the age of 17. Fyodor did not have a copper for personal expenses and, in consequence, did not know how to handle money in later life. Michael and Fyodor were taken to the family coach to the Chermak boarding school and brought back home the same way for the weekends. There were few domestic diversions, and all these were of the most innocent nature. In the summer, the family went to the Darovoy estate. It became Dostoevsky Kolhoz, or collective farm, after 1930, which was bought with great hardship in 1831 after Fyodor's 10th birthday. There the children enjoyed a certain amount of freedom, playing with the village small fry. Nevertheless, the parents always kept a close watch on them as adolescents. Our father, Andrew, the youngest son, used to say, was exceedingly observant and watched after the morality of the children, especially my older brothers, when they were already young men. I do not remember a single occasion when they went out alone. The sisters, who were younger than Fyodor, and the little country girls during the summer were all the feminine society the boy knew up to the age of 16. His first erotic sensations were, of course, bound up with these recollections of childhood, and this was reflected in several ways in his later life and work. As a writer, Dostoevsky revealed a heightened interest in little girls. While corruption of the morals of a minor was a theme of unfailing fascination for him, it was not merely by chance that he devoted to it staggering pages in The Humiliated and Wronged, Crime and Punishment, and The Possessed. The relations between the parents created another unconscious source for first impulses of love and hatred. Dr. Dostoevsky had, it seems clear, those traits of duality and even neurosis which proved so sharply contradictory in his great son. The father loved his children very much, yet ruled them with an iron hand, so that they did not dare to sit down in his presence whenever he tutored them. He willingly spent money on their education, yet was pettily calculating and miserly in everything else. It is true he was poor. Money did not come to him easily, and he had to pinch and scrape to meet his obligations. In buying Daravoy, the estate did not do well. There were several dry spells and a fire, disasters which seemed to the owner too catastrophic to get over and which depended or deepened his natural melancholy. Fyodor, like his father, lived in constant dread of being left without a kopeck, but the father's tight-fistedness was, in the son's case, transformed into reckless generosity, into financial anarchy. Fyodor's gloom, his reserve, his lack of manners, and amiability were wholly inherited from his father. That was underlined by the previous owner. Both father and son had marked characteristics of pettiness, despotism, and irritability. Dr. Dostoevsky was envious and embittered by nature, but he concealed his ambition and selfishness, just as his son did after him. The father led a lonely life. He had no relations of his own. It was his wife's people who came to the house, and the head of the family felt himself isolated. Also, certain of his wife's relations, the merchants Kumanen, for instance, were rich, and this helped to form a complex of discontent and fear and inferiority, which in its turn led to injured pride and pathological touchiness. Maria Dostoevskaya Nechayeva came from a family of well-to-do Moscow merchants. As a matter of fact, she was not a cowed and uncomplaining victim of a tyrannical husband, as certain biographers have gone out of their way to prove, but was innately cheerful, intelligent, and energetic. Naturally, she fully acknowledged the authority of the head of the family, yet was not at all passive and without a voice. She genuinely loved her husband with a deep and ardent love. Her letters to him evince both a naive devotion and a considerable poetic strain. For a woman of the 1830s, with only a modest education, she wrote exceptionally well and showed a certain literary gift which she transmitted to two of her children. She not only did not live in fear and trembling of her fiery-tempered husband, but was his constant prop and helpmate, encouraging him in times of emotional stress and trying to overcome his testiness and melancholy. She always told him and wrote him the harsh truth, to use an expression of hers, about how she felt, gentle and kindly. She was, at the same time, noted for both practicality and shrewdness, and whether in town or country, ran the household with a firm hand, like so many active, typically Russian women, and that was the image of her which Fyodor retained in his memory. In appearance, she was exceptionally feminine and fragile. Her health, weakened by frequent childbirth, was delicate. She was unable to nurse her children and had to hire country wet nurses. While Fyodor was still a child, it was discovered that she had tuberculosis. She was ailing much of the time, and whenever the children wanted to kiss her wasted, blue-veined hand, they had to approach the sick bed where she spent so many of her days. This formed another ineradicable memory. Fyodor was to remember his mother's illness throughout his life, and in his consciousness, love and pity, femininity and blight blended into an indivisible and touching whole. She died comparatively young in 1837, before Fyodor had reached 16. After their mother's death, the father took Michael and Fyodor to St. Petersburg and placed them in the School for Military Engineering. From the monastic seclusion of a clannish family, Fyodor was catapulted into the bureaucratic atmosphere of an inbred military school. The novices, or trouts as they were called, were snubbed and hazed by their seniors. The institution was admittedly of higher scholastic standing than mere military academies, and, as the novelist Leskov noted later on, not a few excellent men emerged from it. However, the spirit of deadening discipline and goose-stepping was there just the same. The other students met Fyodor with jeers. He had neither manners nor money nor an illustrious name. At home, his family had considered him lively, if anything. He was reproached for his liveliness, but his father and his mother agreed that Fyodor was what would now be called a ball of fire. He was the leader in all games and showed an unusually high spirit and imagination. Among strangers, however, he kept to himself. Konstantin Trutovsky, a schoolmate of his, who later became known as artist and academician, academician, tells us that in 1838 Dostoevsky was lean and gawky, that his clothes hung on him like a sack, and that although one could sense his kindliness, he was morose and constrained in appearance and manners. He was unsociable, even ridiculous at times, and must have looked like an unfledged nestling to all those aristocratic youths who at 17 had already been initiated into the mysteries of love by serf girls or St. Petersburg prostitutes. Fyodor, however, was far better at discussing Pushkin, whom he deified. After the poet's death, he asked Dr. Dostoevsky for permission to wear mourning, or Schiller, or historical personalities, anybody in short but women. Only 2 or 3 of his friends knew that, despite his outward listlessness and aloofness, he was an ardent and impulsive youth who could be sharp-tongued on occasion. Even at that time, he was known for his ecstatic idealism and a hypersensitive impressionability. He avoided social calls, did not know how to behave in company, and became dreadfully embarrassed in the society of women. There is a story to the effect that at the beginning of 1840, he fainted away at a soiree given by the Vilgorskys when he was presented to Seniavina, a celebrated beauty of that period. It is possible that this fainting spell was an epileptic seizure. I don't know why my nose is itching so bad. All this does not mean that Dostoevsky was a scarecrow, a simpleton, or altogether ignorant of the facts of life. At any rate, they were brought sharply to his attention in 1839 when he received the staggering news of his father's death. After his wife died, Dr. Dostoevsky had retired to settle down in the country, where he took for his mistress Catherine Alexandrova, who had been his servant in Moscow. He drank hard and flogged his serfs and domestics at the slightest pretext. The train is awful chatty today. The trains, while his apprehensiveness, suspiciousness, and outburst of rage became practically hysterical. When Fyodor wrote him in 1838 about flunking an examination, he had a nervous seizure. This, however, did not prevent Dr. Dostoevsky from writing back to his son in gentle and restrained terms. The peasants hated him and had evidently formed a plot against him in 1839 with the active participation of Efim Maximoff, uncle of the doctor's mistress. One day that summer, when he was cursing them furiously, a group of peasants fell upon the demented landowner and killed him. They must have given a considerable bribe to the authorities, who came to make an investigation. The conclusion of the official report stated that the death of staff physician Dostoevsky, whose mutilated body was found in a grove, had been brought about by an apoplectic stroke. But although the affair was hushed up, it was impossible to conceal the truth from relatives and neighbors. His father's end shocked Fyodor. He was overwhelmed by the particulars of the horrible death, with its combination of drunkenness, lechery, violence, a certain element of mystery, and a succession of prosaic yet enigmatic details. All these facts, together with his own feelings about them, made such a deep impression on his memory that he was able to utilize them 40 years later in the brothers Karamazov, although it is hard to say to what extent the portrait of Karamazov, Pare, coincided with Dostoevsky's recollections of his own father. But even without such literary evidence, it can surely be taken for granted that the 18-year-old youth was deeply shaken by the tragedy at Darovoye, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. Freud maintains that up to that point, Fyodor's illness had been of comparatively innocuous nature. The traumatic shock transformed it into epilepsy. In the opinion of the Viennese analyst, the young man was subconsciously wishing for the death of his father, of whom he was jealous on his mother's account. And when this wish came to pass, the son experienced horror and an insuperable feeling of guilt and remorse. He was ready to accept any punishment to expiate his secret sin. Freud and his disciples utilized the Oedipus complex to explain not only Dostoevsky's masochism and acceptance of suffering, but his rebellion against all forms of authority or paternalism. He, or at any rate the heroes he created, warred against both the Father in heaven and the little Father Tsar, and Dostoevsky always felt that this conflict was criminal, even though it held an unwholesomely strong fascination for him. All his contradictions, all his oscillations between socialism and conservatism, between disbelief and ecclesiasticism, are likewise seen as rooted in a basic psychological defect. Dostoevsky, a subconscious parricide, became a faithful son of church and throne because he was unconsciously impelled to overcome his criminal inclinations. Reconcile yourself, proud man. I believe, I accept, I submit. These words formed his magic exorcism, through which he hoped to be rid of the evil demons of rebelliousness. And is it not remarkable that his most profound and complex novel, The Brothers Karamazov, is built around the theme of parricide, and that all his creativity is dedicated to the problems of crime and punishment in their most varied aspects? No matter what one's attitude may be toward the application of psychoanalytical theories to explain Dostoevsky's personality, it is perfectly obvious that it would be risky to hold the Oedipus complex alone responsible for all his rebelliousness and all the contradictions of his faith and lack of faith, his revolutionism and servile monarchism, his Slavophilism and Westernism, religious anarchism and ecclesiasticism, intuition versus logic. Dostoevsky's intellectual, ideological, and psychological complexity cannot be exhausted by any schematic Freudian interpretation. And this, despite the aptness and justice of many observations made by Freud and his disciples concerning the inner conflicts of Dostoevsky as man and writer. Freud holds that because Dostoevsky could not resolve his Oedipus complex, could not rid himself of it, he endured the pathological manifestations of a neurosis. What's down here? Mold. Of a neurosis usual in such cases, and became an epileptic. During the seizures, he experienced, according to his own admission, an oppressive sense of guilt, just as if he really was a great sinner. This was followed by an instant of lucidity, of complete blissfulness, and then by loss of consciousness and a deep faint. It is precisely this admission which enabled Freud to connect his epilepsy with his secret wishes to kill his father and to be punished for his sinful obsession. Dostoevsky's daughter, one of the most unreliable witnesses as to his life, writes, according to our family traditions, Dostoevsky's first epileptical seizure occurred when he learned about the death of his father. The recollections of those who had known him in his youth, one of them a physician who had attended him for several years, do not confirm this. Orestes Miller, his friend and biographer, placed its first appearance in the writer's early childhood. Lyubov, Fyodor's daughter, claimed it coincided with his father's murder, while Dostoevsky himself referred the beginning of this affliction to his imprisonment in the fortress of Saints Peter and Paul, to his penal servitude, and even to his stay in Semipalatinx. At any rate, the legend that the epilepsy was apparently the consequence of corporal punishment to which Dostoevsky was supposedly subjected during his penal servitude should be rejected as utterly unsubstantiated. Most of the data indicate that the aggravation of Dostoevsky's nervous spells came a number of years after his father's murder, and in all probability was a consequence of his arrest and transportation. There are no indications anywhere that the young Dostoevsky reacted to the event in Darovoy by falling down in epileptic convulsions, and it would be altogether fantastic to accept the assertion of his friend Grigorovich, as related by Zinaida Hippias, that the musics mangled Michael Fyodorovich before his son's eyes. At the time of the murder, Fyodor was hundreds of miles away from Darovoya. Curiously, there is almost no reference to his father's death in Dostoevsky's correspondence. According to his daughter, the murder was considered a horrible and disgraceful affair by the family, and for that reason they hardly mentioned it. It is difficult to judge the correctness of Freud's thesis as to the role played by the Oedipus complex in the life of Dostoevsky. The father image is ambivalent both in his letters to Michael and in his novels. It is possible that to some extent the father's conduct in Darovoy and his relations to women supplied the psychological basis for the lecherous Karamazov-Pere. I don't know what the hell that is since I haven't read the book. The problem of paternal and filial relations is one of the main themes in A Raw Youth, while the interrelations of parents and children contribute to the plots of Natachka, Nesvanova, The Humiliated and Wronged, The Idiot in part, and several other works. It is clear that Dostoevsky always found these problems of the greatest interest, but it is utterly impossible to tell with any assurance upon the basis of the facts available to what degree this interest was due to an unresolved, deeply rooted complex of enmity toward his father and of love for his mother. This also applies to the origin of his affliction, which Freud called an affective and not an organic form of epilepsy. In other words, he was stressing the psychosomatic nature of the disease and spoke of Dostoevsky as a neuropathic subject and not a psychopath. We do not even know whether the frequent spells of poor health in the writer's youth were the manifestations of an acute neurosis or actual seizures of epilepsy. One thing only is known with certainty: the formation of his personality during his teens must have been a difficult and painful process, at times excruciatingly so. A number of factors contributed to the nervousness, susceptibility to impressions, and the pathological sensitivity of the youth. The restraints instilled in him by his bringing up, the habits of a pent-up and sober way of life created by the pious staff physician and his bustling wife, a way of life not at all idyllic. That's pretty cool. Look at that. Perforation, Detroit Pub Library. At all idyllic, but well ordered and definite, disintegrated upon contrast with the new reality of St. Petersburg. A flood of passions abruptly swept away family custom, leaving nothing to take its place. His mother's death, his father's drinking, mistress's hatred of his peasants and their craftiness, the murder of his father, the venality of the officials, the hypocrisy of the people about him. All these were breakthroughs into a sort of primordial chaos, the alarming warnings of a frightening and delirious universe. And in addition to all that, he had to live in a military school in a predominantly bureaucratic capital, to struggle from day to day, to endure the injustices and contradictions of a completely unsympathetic society. Left an orphan at 18 without any help of support, lonely and self-conscious, he suffered cruelly because of the contrast between the honest and Spartan atmosphere of his childhood and his new environment, official and soulless. The things which interested and stirred him left the other young cadets in the engineer's castle unmoved. He dreamt of the creative life, of poetry and freedom. Life confronted him with geometry, the malicious haughtiness of his fellow students, and the stupidity and stolidity of those in charge of him. Occasionally, the ecstasy of awakening thought, the keenness of new sensations, and the sweep of his dreams so engrossed him that the career he was facing turned into a nightmare. I have a project to become a madman, he confided in secret to Michael. To become a madman, i.e., to protect himself against people who annoyed him with their practical demands, their rules of life, their conventions and standards, to remain free and independent behind the bulwark of a feigned madness. At 18, he wrote the prophetic words, "Man is a mystery. It must be unriddled, even if you have to spend all your life in unriddling it. Do not say you have wasted your time. I occupy myself with this mystery, since I want to be a man." You know what I want? Is to hear about Mary, I think her name was. Was that the first? Maria, sorry. I mean, goddamn. I'll fling Freud into into the hot sun. That was a long chapter. I didn't like it. Didn't tell me anything, except you could have did in like 5 sentences that his father was murdered and his mother died young. Goodbye.